Good afternoon, everyone. Hola, buenas, ¿qué tal? Thank you all very much for choosing to spend your siesta here with me. Much appreciated. Before I get started, but what I'm going to talk about, I guess some caveats first of all. I'm going to be talking specifically about the web today. I know that this is a more general technology event, so just to get expectations in check, I'm not sure if all the ideas I'll be talking about will translate beyond the web, so just something to bear in mind. This is web specific. Also, I want to talk about language, and again, I'm going to be specifically talking about the English language, because that's my code base. I hope that some of the concepts will translate into Spanish, and that you'll be able to get something out of it. But yes, talking about language, there'll be some interesting synchronicities, I think, with this morning's keynote from Dave Farley, because he was also talking about language and the terms we use to describe what we do. And that's something I want to dive into, kind of the foibles of our language. Like in English, for example, normally if I'd say I would like to thank each and every one of you for coming, I would mean it as a figure of speech. But here I think I can literally thank each and every one of you for coming. The language ideas I particularly want to talk about are the ideas of metaphor, how we use metaphor in our language. George Lakoff writes about metaphor all the time. He wrote this book, Metaphors We Live By. He also wrote Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things. And the idea of metaphor that we most use is the idea of conceptual metaphor, where we talk about one thing in terms of another thing. And that's particularly useful if we're talking about something that's intangible. So we can talk about an intangible thing as though it were tangible. The classic example of this would be the concept of time. Time is an intangible thing, but in English, at least, we talk about time as though it's a physical object moving through space. We say time flies or time drags. Or we could talk about time as though it was a resource. And we could save time. We can waste time. Of course, time is none of these things. Time is this intangible thing, but that's how we talk about it. So that's conceptual metaphor. But what George Lakoff is particularly interested in is the idea of political metaphor, when the metaphors we use to describe things could potentially change how we are thinking about something. An example he gives in English, if you were about to have a debate, a political debate about tax relief, before the debate has even started, you're framing taxation as something that needs relief, something that you need relief from. So straight away, the argument is kind of weighted because of the metaphor being used. And I'm interested in looking at the metaphors we use and have used in the past to describe the web, seeing as it's a relatively recent thing. How do we talk about something new? How do we talk about something intangible? Well, we're not the first people to run into this issue. There's a terrific book by Scott McCloud. It was written in 1993 called Understanding Comics. And it's about comics, it's about understanding comics. It is itself a comic, it is self-describing. It's really a wonderful book, highly recommend it. And he talks about how people were trying to get their heads around any new medium, whether it's comics or whether it's the web. What you do is you tend to compare it to what's come before, right? You describe the new medium in terms of the medium that came before. He said that, you begin by imitating the predecessors, like many early movies were like filmed stage plays, much early television was like radio with pictures, right? And it's only over time that the new medium gets to develop its own ideas, its own metaphors. Now this description of borrowing from the medium that come before, Scott McCloud here in 1993 is talking about it in terms of comics, but that very same argument was made back in 2000 by John Alsop, and he was talking about the web. It's a wonderful article called A Tao of Web Design. Like I say, written in 2000. So it's 19 years old now, and yet I think it's maybe more relevant now than when it was written. I highly recommend having a read of it. And in this article, John says, when a new medium borrows from an existing one, some of what it borrows makes sense. But over time, much of the borrowing is thoughtless, ritual, and it often constrains the new medium. And over time, the new medium develops its own conventions, throwing off existing conventions that don't make sense. Right? It's kind of like, we had that whole debate about skeuomorphism. It's kind of the idea of taking something from a previous medium, but then discarding it over time as we develop our own kind of metaphors. Now, when the web came along, the medium that existed before was print. So people were kind of trying to treat the web as though it were print. there was this book, Creating Killer Websites by David Siegel, which was specifically about how to try and tame and control the web and give you the same kind of layouts that you were able to do in print, but to do that on the web. This is like 1996, so this is before we even got CSS. David Siegel is the guy who invented using tables for layout and using a spacer GIF to get dimensions. Years later, he wrote an essay called "The Web is Broken and I Broke It," which is maybe overstating the point a little. But John also takes this idea that you copy what you could do in one medium, print, and you start to apply it to this new medium, the web. In A Tao of Web Design, John Alsop says, the web is a new medium, although it has emerged from the medium of printing, whose skills, design language, and conventions strongly influence it. Yet it is too often shaped by that from which it sprang. Killer websites are usually those which tame the wildness of the web, constraining pages as if they were paper. Desktop publishing for the web. Now, he does acknowledge absolutely that we have a lot to learn from the history of print, and before print, illuminated manuscripts in terms of layout, in terms of typography, in terms of usability, right? Kind of coming to its pinnacle with the Swiss design school in the 20th century. So what you have here is this interesting debate between two sides about how to treat the web, right? John Alsop is all about the Tao and letting go of control, that the fluidity of the web is its strength, it's not a weakness. Whereas with David Siegel, he's all about trying to tame that wildness, tame that fluidity, constrain it, treat it like it's print. So it appears to be two very different viewpoints discussing how to design for the web. And yet they have a commonality, because both of them are talking about websites. They're both using the same language, web sites, describing websites as though they are destinations that you go to, like a building site or a construction site. In fact, in the early days of the web, we literally used to have images saying, this is under construction, it's like a building site. I'll give you the full nostalgic effect. There we go. This is like, in the time of GeoCities, everything was under construction. Let's acknowledge it. Everything is still under construction. We just don't put these banners on our sites anymore. So I'm interested in looking at these words we use that might influence our thought. Like, does talking about websites maybe constrain our thinking? And how do we describe ourselves? How do we describe the work we do, what we are? Well, here's a really popular metaphor to describe our work. We're like architects. Right? I've caught myself using this. I've heard my colleagues. I've run a design studio called Clearleft, and my colleague would be like, "Oh yeah, well we're kind of like the architects, designing the plan, and then people build it." It's a really popular one. People really like comparing themselves to architects. I don't think it's specific to the web. I just think in general people like comparing themselves to architects. I blame Hollywood, because architects in movies are always sympathetic characters. Like, you never have a villain who's an architect. It's always, someone you can really sympathize with. And I would say there are things we absolutely can learn from architecture. I know many a UX designer who feel that this is the best book ever written about UX. It's not about UX, it's about architecture. 101 Things I Learned in Architecture School by Matthew Frederick, published in 2007. But there's a lot we can learn. I do find it funny, though, that if you actually talk to somebody in the architecture business, they talk about what a terrible industry it can be sometimes, like have these competitions for things. They do spec work all the time. Really, you don't want to be imitating it. So this could influence the web in a positive way, to think about our work this way. There's another book that definitely influenced not just the web, but I think software in general, that came straight from architecture. And that is A Pattern Language, Christopher Alexander. This is a classic book. And my definition of a classic book is a book that everyone's heard of and nobody's read. Published in 1977, and it was a huge influence on a number of areas, but specifically software. Ward Cunningham, the inventor of the wiki, he credits this book for some of the ideas. The Gang of Four, who went on to write design patterns, elements of reusable object-oriented software, they were directly influenced by a pattern language, this idea of modular components, right? Directly influencing software. What's funny is that in the architecture world, it didn't have nearly that much influence. In fact, Molly Wright Steenson wrote this book, Architectural Intelligence, where she looks specifically at the world of design and architecture, physical product design and architecture, and its influence on the digital design spheres. And you've got things like information architecture being the obvious one, but also things like a pattern language, Christopher Alexander. And she points out, architects don't like him very much. They think he's kind of preachy. His ideas never actually went that far in the world of architecture, but in the world of software and definitely the web, oh boy, did it go far. I mean, modular components, design systems, right? They are so hot right now. I actually put on an event all about design systems in Brighton for the last couple of years. And we had all these great speakers, right? There's Gina Ann and Alla Kolmatova. And by the end of the day, I was saying I should have had a drinking game during the day, which was any time somebody references a pattern language by Christopher Alexander, take a drink, because it got referenced a lot. The full drinking game was going to be anytime someone references Christopher Alexander, take a drink. Anytime someone says Lego, take a drink. Anytime someone says that naming things is hard, take a drink. Anytime someone says atomic design, take a drink. And anytime someone says bootstrap, you can puke the drink back up. There's another book about architecture that has directly influenced me, or certainly I find it very hard to get it out of my head. And that's a book called How Buildings Learn by Stuart Brand. Again, classic book. No one's read it. Published in 1994. There was a television series to go with it. And in this book, he highlights the idea of a British architect named Frank Duffy. And Frank Duffy talked about buildings in an interesting way. He said, a building, properly conceived, is several layers of longevity, so time scales. And he called these layers shearing layers, and that they move at different speeds. So this site that a building sits on, you're kind of talking about geological timescales there. The actual structure should hopefully last for centuries. Then the skin, the outside, the walls, the doors, you could change them every few decades. You got the services, the plumbing, the infrastructure, till you get down to the level of a room where you got stuff in a room like furniture that you could move around on a daily or hourly basis. Right? So you got all these different time scales operating here. And he's talking specifically here about buildings, shearing layers as applied to buildings. What I find interesting about it, though, is, as well as this idea of different time scales, the fact that each layer depends on the layer below. You can't have a structure until you've got a site. You can't have doors and walls until you have the outside structure. So each layer depending on the layer that's come before. And that resonates with an idea I came across in books by Stephen Johnson, like Where Good Ideas Come From, where he talks about an idea called the adjacent possible, where something has to be invented first before you can get to the next level, right? So before we can have electricity, we kind of have to have industrialization. And we need electricity to get to circuitry, which we need to get to computers, which we need to get to networks, which we need to get to internet, to the World Wide Web. Just like, for Facebook or Google to exist, the World Wide Web must exist first. And for the World Wide Web to exist, the internet has to exist, and so on. There's these layers and layers. So this idea of the adjacent possible, Stephen Johnson uses it to describe why, for example, the microwave oven could not be invented in medieval Europe, because there's too many other stages need to happen before you get to the microwave oven. But again, layers, right? Layers that depend on the layer below. Now, this idea of shearing layers that Stuart Brand was writing about in How Buildings Learn, he came back to a few years later. He talked about this in a book called The Clock of the Long Now. Stuart Brand is one of the co-founders of the Long Now Foundation, a foundation dedicated to long-term thinking. They're building a clock that will tell time for 10,000 years. And in this book, he abstracts the idea of shearing layers, which are specifically about architecture, to pace layers, which is just much more generic. And as an example of pace layers in action, he applies it to us, our world, the human civilization. He points out that, you've got, our nature, and then culture, governance, infrastructure, commerce, fashion. And again, I think each one kind of depends on the one before, but what he's pointing out here is that you've got these different time scales, that you've got these much faster moving things up the top, right? So nature is like our physiological nature. What makes us human at the level of DNA hasn't changed for tens of thousands of years. Physiologically, a caveman and an astronaut are the same. Culture builds up over centuries, right? Accrued stuff. Governance, not governments, governance, in other words, methods of governance, change, not too quickly, not too slowly. You don't want things changing too quickly, but you don't want things to get stale either. Infrastructure, you kind of needs to move a bit faster. Then you get to commerce, very fast moving, and then fashion, which is just like crazy. And by fashion here, he's talking about any kind of popular culture, right? Things like pop music, for example. The idea is to try everything out quickly. What about this? No, forget that. What about this? What about this? What about this? Now, over time, stuff can filter down. Like the really good fashion maybe ends up at the layer of culture, but it's at the top layer of fashion that you experiment, right? So the way that he describes these layers, he says, so the top is fast and the bottom is slow. He says, fast learns, slow remembers. Fast proposes, slow disposes. Fast is discontinuous, and slow is continuous. Fast and small instructs slow and big by accrued innovation and occasional revolution. And slow and big controls fast and small by constraint and constancy. And fast gets all our attention, but slow has all the power. Now, this idea of pace layers has really stuck with me, and I kind of see it everywhere. Like this morning when Dave Farley was talking about, the loop of, there's you got code, and then you got release cycles, and you got the. I was just immediately thinking that's pace layers. That's pace layers. It's one of those things I constantly see, and I kind of see it on the web. I think we can apply this idea of pace layers to the web. So at the bottom layer, moving slowly, hasn't changed in a long time. You've got the internet itself. The transmission control protocol, internet protocol, super simple, low-level protocols, designed in 1974 by Bob Kahn and Vint Cerf, really not changed much. And that's good. You'd have to kind of rip out the internet and start again to change it. On top of that, we get all the different protocols we can use. Protocols for email, file transfer protocol, and of course, in our case, the hypertext transfer protocol. And again, that's slow to change. It has changed over time. We've now got HTTP 2, right? But it hasn't been fast. And again, that feels correct that there isn't a new version of HTTP every month. That would be weird. Now, then there's our URLs, which I wish I could put at the lowest level and say URLs never change. That would be wonderful. I must acknowledge the reality that on the web, URLs disappear all the time. But we can still fight to keep them around, try to keep them around as long as possible. And then when you need to have a URL in order to put something at that URL, and what we've got to put at that URL is, well, HTML, which has changed over time. Like the first version of HTML had about 25 elements, now we've got about 125 elements. But the pace has been manageable. The last big influx was with HTML5, maybe like 8-9 years ago, and I feel like we can stay on top of that pace of change. Now, maybe moving a bit faster, more innovation will be the CSS layer. We get new things more often than we get new HTML, right? Whether it's Flexbox, Grid, new things. But again, I feel like I can stay on top of it. It is relatively fast changing, the world of CSS, but I can stay on top of it. And then there's the JavaScript ecosystem. And I'm not just talking about the language JavaScript here. I'm talking about JavaScript and the ways of working with JavaScript, the frameworks, the tooling, all of that. And this is the point where I throw up my hands like, I cannot keep up. It's too much. It moves too fast. There's no way I can keep track of all of it. Does anybody else feel that way about the pace of change? Okay, take a look around you so you see who else has got their hands up, because you are not alone, right? But what I find is by mapping these technologies to pace layers, I can kind of say, oh, it's okay. In fact, JavaScript is meant to move fast. Remember I said the idea of the fashion layers, it proposes. It goes, what about this? No, forget that. What about this? That's exactly what we're doing. It's like, this is the tool chain to use today. No, forget that. We're using this one. No, you're still using that framework? No. Now we're using this framework, right? Really fast, but sort of the idea. And again, the idea being that the good ideas would filter down the stack. Like, I remember the earliest examples of JavaScript were things like doing image rollovers or form validation. Does that email address really look like an email address? Did the user actually fill in that required field? And now I wouldn't even use JavaScript to do those tasks, right? I would use :hover in CSS to do rollovers. I would use input type equals email required in HTML to do form validation. So the good ideas do stick around and make their way down into the more constant sort of declarative layers of the web. And the other thing about mapping these layers is that I realized this maps very much to the way I think about building for the web. I kind of don't think too much about the internet itself and routing packets around. I feel like I can leave that happen, but I do think URL-first design is a good way to go. Like you're planning the information architecture, think about the URLs first, and very much thinking about the structure of your content, the HTML, before considering the presentation with CSS, before considering the behavior with JavaScript. So one of the things about the web, though, is that even though I might think this is actually a really great way to build for the web, in this kind of layered way, consider each layer before moving on to the layer above it, the web is so flexible that you don't have to do this. You aren't forced into this model of building on the web. It's a very flexible medium. In fact, if you want, you can build on the web like this, where you still assume the presence of a network, right, the internet, but then you just do everything else in JavaScript. So the URL part, routing stuff around, normally be done by a server, let's do that on the client. The DOM, the content, the HTML, let's do it all in JavaScript, right? CSS in JS, why not? This is pretty much the architecture of single-page apps, right? You've got the internet and you've got JavaScript, and everything happens in JavaScript. And as I said, it is a testament to the flexibility of the web that this is your choice. You can choose to build this way. I tend to not build this way, because what it has the effect of doing is kind of creating this one single point of failure, for one thing, but that will be true of just about any technology choice, but also kind of turns the web into this binary thing, where as long as you've got HTTP and you've got JavaScript, great, it works great. If JavaScript's missing or something goes wrong with the JavaScript, then it just doesn't work at all. And you're reduced to two options. It works great, or it doesn't work at all. Now, this approach actually makes total sense in another medium. If, for example, you're building a native app for a phone, it makes total sense to think this way. If you build an iOS app and I have an iOS device, it works great. I get 100% of what you've designed. If you build an iOS app and I have an Android device, it doesn't work at all. Obviously, you can't install an iOS app onto an Android device. It just doesn't work. I get 0% of what you've designed. So this thinking, this binary thinking, makes total sense in another medium. But I don't think it makes sense in the layered medium of the web. I think it makes more sense to build like this, that we can go from something that doesn't work to just about works, right? Maybe it's just HTML and nothing else. Works fine, we're adding styling, whatever. Works well, right? We're adding the delighters on there too. Works great, that somebody's getting exactly what I intended. Because I think it's one of the great things about the web that I can build something, and maybe you don't get 100% of what I intended on your particular device, on your particular browser, but you also probably won't get 0. You'll get something in between, hopefully in the high 90s or 80s, right? And I think that's a real strength of the web. Also, the fact that this way of thinking, this layered approach, maps so nicely to the technology, right? To building in this layered way. And I'm not the only one thinking this way. I'm going to quote Ethan Marcotte. He says, "I like designing in layers. I love looking at the design of a page, a pattern, whatever, and thinking about how it will change if, say, fonts aren't available, or JavaScript doesn't work, or if someone doesn't see the design as you or I might, and is having the page read aloud to them." So here it's kind of now about resilience, that this approach is actually a way of building something that's better lasting, stronger. Now, Ethan, of course, you'll probably know from the idea of responsive web design, which he first debuted as an article on A List Apart, the same place where John Alsop wrote his Tao of Web Design in 2000. This was Ethan writing in 2010. And one of the first things he does in this article is quote John Alsop's article about Tao of Web Design, building on top of John's ideas, building in layers, if you will. Okay, so architecture, has some things to show us. In fact, the term responsive web design came directly from architecture. The idea of responsive design started in architecture, the idea of buildings responding to the people using them. And Ethan took that term, that metaphor, if you will, and applied it to the web. So architecture maybe does have some things we have learned from and could learn from again. It's not the only metaphor we use, and this is where I'm going to reference directly to this morning's keynote, because the other metaphor we like using about ourselves is to talk of ourselves as engineers. Now, I will freely admit I have a soft spot for the term software engineer, and that's because of where it came from. As you heard, it's Margaret Hamilton writing the code for the command module for the Apollo landings, code that would then be literally woven into the computer. The Apollo landings being, I think, the perfect synthesis of hardware, right? The most amazing hardware ever constructed, software, and humans, right? Hardware, software, and humans working together. It is just one kind of engineering, though. So let's try and look at engineering more abstractly. And whether we're talking about whatever field of engineering, it tends to break down into these things you have to balance. As an engineer, you've got the materials you're working with, and you've got the tools you use on a day-to-day basis to shape those materials. So let's try applying this to the web. Well, the materials we have, as I say, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, hopefully in that order, building in those layers. What about the tools we use to design on the web? They're the very obvious design tools, graphic design tools, some of them written specifically for the web, some of them not, and we've adapted them to work on the web. And so these are obvious tools. I would say there are more tools than this, though. I think we have to acknowledge that these are tools as well, email, Slack, spreadsheets, that it's very hard to get a project done without some work happening in these tools. We call them productivity tools. I know sometimes it feels like we're not being productive when we're using these tools. But these are productivity tools, but if you think about it, all tools are productivity tools. That's literally what tools are for, to make you more productive. But let's get specific again on the web and web development we're building. And this is where we have a lot of tools. Again, I think we're up at the fashion layer here with version control systems and build tools, task runners, pipelines, frameworks, all that kind of stuff. These ones, okay, I'm going to put these tools into one kind of bucket. Because what all these kind of things have in common, preprocessors, version control, and stuff, is that they sit on your computer, or maybe on a server, but they sit on a computer and they're a tool for you to use while you're building the website. But the end user never gets exposed to these tools. The end user is exposed to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So I don't know how to describe these tools. Maybe these are like the interior tools, right? Imagine there's like a firewall between the people making the websites and the people actually consuming them. All these tools live behind that firewall. So when it comes to choosing these tools, my attitude is use whatever you want because it doesn't affect the end user, not directly, right? I mean, I know there are knock-on effects. The better a tool is, the quicker you can build, and that affects the end user. But none of these directly touch the end user. So my attitude when it comes to choosing these tools is like, yeah, use whatever you want. As long as it works for you or your team, go for it. However, there's another category of tools that are somewhat different, and it brings up this other balancing act I think we need to do on the web, which is between the needs of users and the needs of engineers, right? And all those other tools I was talking about, well, they're there for the engineers, right, the developers, so use what you want. But maybe there's a whole category of tool where you kind of have to ask, what's better for the user? So here I'm talking about the tools that would directly expose themselves to end users. So if you use a CSS framework to make yourself more productive, that's great, but now the user has to download the CSS framework so you get the benefit. If you use a JavaScript library, the user has to, if I'm talking about on the client side here, not on the server side. If it's on the server side, great, it's an internal tool. If you use a client-side JavaScript library for your benefit, then the user has to download the whole library for you to get the benefit. So then there's a cost to the user so that the engineer gets the benefit. So I don't think we should apply the same thinking to these external user-facing tools that we do to the internal tools. I don't think it's enough to say, hey, use whatever you're comfortable with. Use whatever's good for you and your team. I think you need to ask more questions. Now, the obvious question to ask of any tool is to say, well, how well does it work? How well does it do the job it's meant to do? And that's a great question, and absolutely you should be asking that of your tools. But I think there's a more important question to ask of our tools, and that's, how well does it fail? if a technology fails badly, then you get stuck in that situation where something either works great or doesn't work at all, single point of failure. Now, what I like about the web is that it fails really well if you're building in this layered way, right? If something goes wrong at one of those higher levels of JavaScript or CSS, again, it's not going to be perfect what gets delivered, but it still works. And this works at the individual levels too, right? You can use a newest CSS property that isn't fully supported everywhere, and that's okay. It's going to fail gracefully. You can use an HTML element that isn't supported in every browser. That's fine. It fails well. It answers that question. How well does it fail? Yeah, pretty well. So there's a kind of an almost like paradoxical way of approaching this, is that you almost want to choose the technologies that are simpler, that are kind of dumber in a way, because they fail better. And that brings up a principle that was a principle directly applied to the web. Tim Berners-Lee has written about this principle influencing him, and it's the principle of least power. The principle of least power states, choose the least powerful language suitable for a given purpose. This is specifically about programming. And it sounds contradictory. Why would I choose the least powerful language for what I'm trying to do? But the point being that the least powerful language is also might be going to be more resilient, safer, more well-supported. To give you an example on the web, Derek Featherstone said, in the web front-end stack, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and ARIA, if you can solve a problem with a simpler solution lower in the stack, you should. It's less fragile, it's more foolproof, and it just works, right? So yeah, if you want to make this page element that looks like a button that submits a form, you could, generate that in JavaScript, generate a div or something, and then add the event handlers, and then add the ARIA necessary to make it accessible, and then do all the listening to go to submit the form. Or you could use a button, right? You could just go lower in the stack, use the more boring, safer technology. So this is the idea of the principle of least power. And I think it makes a lot of sense, particularly on the web, because on the web there's another principle, another law of nature that very much applies, and that is Murphy's Law, which states anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Edward Aloysius Murphy, Jr., aerospace engineer. And because he had this attitude, nobody ever died on his watch, right? You don't just assume the happy path. Assume something's going to go wrong and then build for that. And you will find yourself building in that layered way if you do that. I mean, other industries do that. They don't assume the best case scenario. The automobile industry will strap crash test dummies into cars and fling them at walls at high speed. Now, admittedly, the regulation to do that came after time, but the point here is that they're not just assuming the best case scenario. They don't say, you know what, we're not going to strap crash test dummies into our cars and smash them against walls at high speed, because we've looked at the numbers and most of our cars are driven by people, not crash test dummies. And secondly, most people are just driving on roads. They're not smashing into walls. So, edge case, right? Yes, of course, you hope for the best, but I think you have to prepare for the worst, particularly on the web where there's so much that we don't know. Trent Walton, web designer, he said, like cars designed to perform in extreme heat or on icy roads, websites should be built to face the reality of the web's inherent variability. The reality of the web's inherent variability. This is going right back to that idea from the Tao of web design, that the web is this flexible medium. So engineering, I don't think we're treating it like this. And let's move away from the automobile industry. This morning, Dave Farley said, whenever he talks about engineering, people inevitably bring up bridges. And I'm going to bring up bridges. But I'm going to bring up a specific bridge, the Quebec Bridge, a cantilever bridge. Construction starts in 1904. Now, Theodore Cooper was the engineer in charge. His firm had won the competition, spec work, no doubt. And he changed the designs pretty early. He lengthened the bridge from 490 meters to 550 meters. He wanted it to be longer than the Firth Bridge. But he didn't recalculate any of the stresses, and they were already high. Also, he refused to work on site. He was based down in New York. So he wasn't even going to be there. And he refused to have his work reviewed, double-checked. There would be no code reviews for this bridge. So construction's going ahead. In 1907, a young engineer, Norman McClure, he reported bending. This was August 6th, 1907. and then later on the 27th, the bending got worse. So word gets down to Theodore Cooper in New York. There's bending going on here. Now, Cooper does send a telegram from New York. And the telegram reads, "Place no more load on Quebec Bridge until all facts considered." But the telegram was kind of ignored because he didn't specifically say, stop working on the bridge. So they carried on working. And it was the next day, it was shortly before the whistle was going to blow to mark the end of work, that the bridge went, August 29th. 75 of the 85 workers on that bridge died. Now, something interesting started happening in Canada a few years later. In 1925, Canadian engineering schools began holding a private ceremony. This wasn't a qualification ceremony. This was separate from your qualifications. It was called the Ritual of the Calling of the Engineer. And you would speak an obligation. Also, you would receive an iron ring. There was an early myth that this was actually made from the steel from the Quebec Bridge. That's not true, but the idea of the Quebec Bridge was definitely looming large here. And this ring would be a symbol of pride, but also humility. And you wore it on the little finger of your working hand. So it would brush against your paper or your keyboard as a constant reminder of your responsibility. And this is why I take issue with us calling ourselves software engineers. I don't think we've earned it. Unless you're actually sending people to the moon, I feel it maybe belittles the term. I believe in Canada you cannot call yourself a software engineer. So what do we call ourselves? If not architects, if not engineers? I don't know, maybe we got it right in the GeoCity days, right? Maybe we're just builders, I know it's not as glamorous as the life of an engineer or an architect, but maybe you can acknowledge that, we work together to build things. Oh, what's so wrong with that? Christopher Alexander, when he was writing a pattern language, he said, most of the wonderful places of the world were not made by architects, but by people. Why don't we call ourselves bricklayers? Because, we work with pretty amazing bricks. We've abstracted away, but just think about it, like the brick of hypertext, the link. I think we've forgotten how amazing something like the link is, and we get to work with it every day. I can point to a resource over there, and on the same page point to a resource over there, and this is the first time in the history of the web that anyone's pointed those two resources on the same page. That's kind of amazing. We can build brick by brick, in layers, if you will. I guess it kind of matters what we choose to build. There's this apocryphal story of a traveler coming across a site where building is going on, and he asks the first person, "What are you doing?" He says, "Well, I'm just putting stones on top of one another." He says to the second person, who's doing the exact same work, he says, "What are you doing?" He says, "Oh, I'm building a wall." And he asks the third person, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm building a cathedral." And maybe that's what matters far more than what we call ourselves or the metaphors we use, is what we build. Thank you. Muchas gracias.